You wake up in a chamber that smells of ancient dust and damp stone. No tourist lanterns, no cameras, no laughter to break the silence. Only you and an air so heavy it feels as though the walls themselves are breathing memory. You reach out, your fingers brush against faded hieroglyphs, names carved with divine patience but later erased with calculated hatred. Each symbol is a scar, a life that once existed, a lineage that ruled, an empire that traded with Rome and raised more pyramids than its northern neighbors. And yet, you never heard their names in school, never saw them in documentaries that claim to tell everything. The paradox gnaws at you. Here lies a people who stretched their power, who blazed and done the Nile sun and who today are barely an echo. Their gold, their trade, their cities, forgotten as though they had never burned with glory. How can a civilization be so immense in stone, and yet so non-existent in memory? You feel it is not neglect, but sentence. Because history is not a faithful mirror, it is a chosen tomb. And the question, inevitable, drags you down like a lament. What happens when power decides which voices survive and which are condemned to eternal silence? The tomb's twilight opens, and as you step out, you hear a distant murmur, water striking stone. The Nile, the river that seems eternal, breaks here in violence. Its cataracts roar like chained beasts, white foam, jagged rocks, currents that refuse to obey. For travelers, they were a wall, an impassable boundary. For those who lived on its banks, they were a natural shield. In those turbulent waters, the kingdom of was born, between 2500 and 1500 BC, a power forged in the river's relentless current. Here, strength did not flow from the north, but from the south. Power upriver, that was the invisible law. Nubia controlled the gold that made Egypt's temples shine, the ivory that adorned thrones, the incense burned upon altars. Everything that fed pharaonic greatness first passed through Nubian hands. Was no satellite, it was the hidden heart that set the region's pulse. And yet, think of how it was taught to us. As if the Nile only flowed in one direction, from Egypt toward glory, from Nubia toward oblivion. But the water itself denies that lie. For sometimes a river runs against all expectation, and the history of Africa, too, has been told in reverse. The roar of the river fades, and in its place appears a more unsettling vision, a pharaoh with dark skin, an African face, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. It is no mirage, it is the dynasty that is rarely spoken of, the between 747 and 656 BC, when the kings of Kush did not merely trade with Egypt, they conquered it and ruled it. Names that should be etched into common memory, but instead lie buried in dusty cases, in museum basements where the light barely reaches. Imagine the dissonance of seeing these figures in stone, hidden in the back cordons, while the main galleries celebrate a whitewashed Egyptology. As if the greatest taboo were not royal incest, neo-ritual executions, but something far simpler, acknowledging that pharaohs also had black faces. In his Victory Stela, describes how he accepted the surrender of his enemies and allowed them to live. He who enters my palace shall not be slain, he commanded, an act of mercy almost unthinkable in ancient war. And yet, these kings were branded barbarians, intruders, African shadows staining Egyptian perfection. The irony bleeds by itself, the so-called savages, revealing a civilization more human than that of the civilized. You step deeper into the desert, and the silence is broken not by water, but by the echo of fire. Imagine it, the city of, between 800 BC and 350 CE, alive with the roar of furnaces. The air heavy with smoke, sparks rising into the night, the clang of hammers shaping destiny. Here they mastered the secrets of iron long before Europe dared to dream of such heat. Not bronze, not copper, iron. The meta of empires, forged in African hands. Even now, the land itself bears the scars, mountains of blackened slag scattered across the sands, silent monuments to an industrial revolution that began on this soil. Walk among them and you feel as if the desert is still smoldering, still whispering of a brilliance almost erased. But when colonial archaeologists uncovered these furnaces, their eyes narrowed with disbelief. To them, the thought was intolerable, that Africans had lit this fire without Greece, without Rome, without a guiding hand from the Mediterranean. And so, they buried the truth and then theories of influence and borrowing, as if prejudice could rewrite the furnaces themselves. Tragedy is heavier than the iron itself. Innovation existed, yet the memory of it was chained. Brilliance smothered and then centuries of doubt, as if to remind you, history is not about what was achieved, but about who is allowed to be seen achieving it. The glow of furnaces fades, and in its place rises the sound of war drums. From the smoke steps not a king, but a queen, a ruler whose very name Rome learned to fear. Among them, one stands carved in fire, who reigned from Chalice to Dus BC. She did not rule from a distant throne. She led her armies with her own hands, a spear in her grip, her eye lost in battle against the legions of Augustus Caesar. Picture it, Rome at the height of its empire, and defeated, relentless, and yet here, in the deserts of Kush, they met resistance so fierce they were forced to halt. Scarred but unbroken, fought them to a standstill, until Augustus himself accepted negotiation. Few in history can claim to have forced Rome to retreat. She did. And her victory was more than a treaty. Beneath her palace steps lay a bronze head of Augustus, turned from a statue, buried at her threshold so that each day she could walk upon his face. Imagine the weight of her foot pressing into the metal, an empire humbled and then her stride. Yet the paradox cuts deep. Cleopatra, the Greek queen of Egypt, is remembered in endless paintings, plays, and films. The one-eyed lioness who defied Caesar lingers in obscurity. Why does the world worship a woman Rome seduced, yet forget the queen who made Rome kneel? The footsteps fade into silence, and what remains is not the clash of swords, but the quiet scratch of ink upon papyrus. Power was not only forged in iron or carried on spears, it was pressed into symbols. The script, born more than 2,000 years ago, stands as one of Africa's oldest writing systems. Yet even now, its lines remain a locked door. Look closely, the marks are elegant, deliberate, a language flowing like the Nile itself. We can recognize numbers, fragments of names, the skeleton of administration. But the flesh, their trees, their prayers, their laughter whispered between lovers, remains sealed. Each symbol is a mouth that moves without sound, a ghost straining to be heard. Imagine the torment, entire libraries of thought collapsed into mute stone. Their literature, their philosophy, their jokes, all swallowed by a silence more permanent than any conquest. To build pyramids and palaces is to leave a body, to write is to leave a soul. And here, the body survives, but the soul is caged behind signs we cannot read. This is the cruelest irony. Civilizations can shape mountains and terrify empires, yet if their words are lost, their inner lives vanish, as though humanity itself agreed to forget what they once deemed. The silence of unread words lingers, and into that word rises another sound, the distant toll of hammers, the creak of ships, the murmur of merchants by the sea. From the south, a new power awakens, the kingdom of Axum, between Axum and Nososat Sea, its shadow lengthening over the fading light of Kush. Imagine yourself as a Elden, standing at the river's edge, watching the horizon shift. The Red Sea has become Axum's highway, its ports alive with trade that once flowed through your own hands. Spices, silk, ivory, gold, all slipping toward their harbors instead of yours. And with trade came something sharper than swords, faith wielded as strategy. In 1330, King embraced Christianity, not as quiet devotion, but as political weapon. By aligning with Rome's new creed, he transformed belief into empire, anchoring his throne to the rising power of the Mediterranean world. While Kush clung to gods etched in unreadable script, Axum cloaked itself in the language of Rome's heaven. You feel it like sand slipping through fingers, your relevance draining away, your temples growing quiet while there's echo with hymns. The silence of is mirrored now by the silence of power itself, as the axis of history tilts southward. What is the death of a civilization, if not the moment its neighbors stop listening? You walk deeper into Axum's shadow, and there it rises before you, a tower of stone so immense it seems to pierce the clouds. The obelisk of Axum, 126 feet of solid granite carved as a single body. Even today, engineers marvel, how did hands without steel cranes raise such a colossus, balance it, and etch it with perfect lines? To stand beneath it is to feel your own body dwarfed, as if you were a shadow in the presence of eternity. But these stelae were never mere monuments. Look closer, windows and doors carved into the rock, false openings leading nowhere. To the living they were illusions, to the dead they were threshold. Each carved frame whispered of a passage between worlds, a doorway where breath ended but existence did not. Granite became theology, architecture became prayer. And yet, colonial eyes saw only the weight of stone, never the weight of meaning. They measured the height, but not the silence between the carved windows. They praised the engineering, but ignored the cosmology. Africa, to them, was allowed to be muscular but never metaphysical. So the obelisks stand, still cutting the sky, still carrying secrets in their shadows, reminders that civilizations are not just measured in conquest, but in the unseen dimensions they dared to carve into eternity. The obelisks still gleam beneath the sun, but their shadow lengthens into something darker. Wealth, once a blessing, begins to twist into curse. Gold, the very metal that crowned pharaohs and fed Axum's splendor, became the lure that drew strangers closer, not as partners, but as predators. At first, caravans came with salt, cloth, horses, meeting gold with fair exchange. But over centuries, the balance shifted. What was once mutual respect hardened into hunger. Across the western Sahel rose another power, the kingdom of Ghana, from 300 to 1200 C, not today's nation, but the empire whose hands controlled the veins of the desert. Their cities glittered, their markets thronged with life, their rulers sat upon thrones gilded with the very dust of kings. And yet, each ounce of gold mined and traded was also a signal fire, drawing more eyes from across the horizon. The irony stings like ash. The richer Ghana became, the less secure it was. For every coin minted in Europe, for every jewel set in a crown, someone remembered the desert's hidden rivers of metal. Gold made Ghana powerful, yes, but it also painted a target across its walls, a silent invitation for envy, invasion, and eventual collapse. Gold drifts into memory, but in Mali it transforms into something more enduring than meta, knowledge. And then Mansa Musa, who reigned from 1312 to 1337 C, Timbuktu was not merely a marketplace of wealth, it was a sanctuary of mind. Picture the Sankor Mosque, its earthen walls alive with recitation, its courtyards filled with students copying lines beneath the sun. Here, astronomy mapped the heavens, mathematics calculated the unseen, medicine dissected the mysteries of flesh. While Europe staggered through its dark ages, Timbuktu's scholars debated eternity with fingers. The treasure was not in coins but in manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, bound in leather, stacked in wooden chests. Pages on surgery, law, theology, and poetry, words flowing like the Niger itself, carrying a civilization's voice across generations. But the weight of tragedy presses in. When outsiders came, proclaiming Africa to be voiceless, these manuscripts became target. Many were burned, their wisdom curling into ash. Others were sold, scattered to collectors who prized the object but not the soul. Families buried texts beneath the sand, praying the desert would keep them safe, as if knowledge itself needed to be hidden like contraband. The irony is unbearable. A city that once outshone the world's learning is remembered not for its brilliance, but for the silence forced upon its books. The ashes of Timbuktu drift into the wind, and before you rise walls, silent, immense, undeniable. In southern Africa, between 1100 and 1450 C, stood Great Zimbabwe, a city encircled by stone. Each block cut and placed without mortar, fitted so precisely that centuries of rain could not pry them apart. The walls curved like waves, enclosing courtyards where whispers carried as though guided by design. To walk there was to feel architecture not as shelter, but as language, stone speaking to stone. Far to the west, another marvel stretched beyond imagination. The walls of Benin began around 800 and completed only in 1897. A labyrinth of earthworks and ramparts, they called around the kingdom for thousands of miles, 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. When Europeans first beheld them, they described mathematical perfection, unable to comprehend how such symmetry had risen from African soil. And yet, disbelief became its own weapon. Colonial scholars twisted themselves into fantasy, inventing lost Phoenicians, mythical white tribes, any explanation but the truth staring them in the face, that Africans had built these wonders with their own hands, their own genius. The tragedy cuts deeper than erasure. It is theft of recognition, the insistence that brilliance must wear another face. Walls that should have been monuments to pride became mirrors of Europe's denial. The walls crumble into shadow, and in that darkness comes the stench of smoke and iron. What could not be denied was not preserved, it was destroyed. The slave trade did not descend upon empty villages, it haunted the very centers of civilization. Portuguese flames devoured the libraries of Benin, their ash rising like black snow into the night. Raiders moved with precision, seizing not just bodies but minds, priests, scribes, builders, healers, the keepers of knowledge ripped first, as if to hollow out entire cultures from within. Imagine the grotesque irony, the same hands that chained men and women in the holds of ships declared those same captives came from savage land. Civilizations with walls longer than China's, universities older than Oxford's, and monuments that pierced heaven were reduced to silence by the very mouths that profited from their ruin. Below deck, the true libraries groaned. Scholars, artisans, musicians, stacked as cargo. Languages drowned in salt air, prayers smothered in the creak of wood and the crack of whips. Each chained throat carried centuries of memory, now condemned to rot in darkness. The silence was not absence, it was engineered, calculated, necessary for the lie to survive. To enslave, one must first erase. To profit, one must first pretend there was nothing worth destroying. And so the greatest theft was not gold, nor ivory, nor even flesh, it was the annihilation of memory itself. The silence of slavers gave way to a golden violence, when draped in the language of science. Early anthropologists knelt over African skulls, calipers in hand, measuring angles and curves as if bone could testify against history itself. They declared, too small, too primitive, incapable of building cities or crafting empires. And yet, their boots stood upon the shattered walls of Great Zimbabwe, their shadows fell across the ashes of Timbuktu, their hands pried open crates filled with Benin's bronzes. It was a perfect circle of deceit. First, burn the libraries. Then, loot the art. Finally, proclaim with scholarly certainty that no libraries, no art, no civilization had ever existed. The evidence was there, in the very artifacts they stole, but truth was less profitable than myth. Consider the British Museum, still holding more than 900 Benin Bronzes, gleaming proof of mastery in metalwork. While these treasures sat in London, British textbooks said that Africans had never worked metal at all. The contradiction was not ignorance, it was strategy. To own the object while denying its origin is the cruelest theft of all. This is anthropology's original sin, to study a people not to understand them, but to erase them more efficiently. To turn living cultures into specimens, and stolen brilliance into trophies. For centuries, the story of Africa was told by those who sought to diminish it. But now, the evidence is written in something they cannot burn, cannot loot, cannot silence, DNA. Modern genetic analysis confirms what African oral traditions carried for generations, that people, ideas, and bloodlines flowed freely across deserts, rivers, and seas. The Nile was not a boundary but a bridge. And the results are rewriting history. Pharaohs once painted as distant from Africa are revealed to carry unmistakable ancestry. Genetic traces ripple outward, showing Mediterranean civilizations infused with African bloodlines, trade routes doubling as beds of kinship. Each strand of DNA is a fragment of testimony, proving that Africa was not isolated but central, a source, not a shadow. For some, these revelations spark unease. Centuries of scholarship built on denial now tremble under the weight of molecular truth. What colonial prejudice tried to erase, blood itself preserves. This is history reborn, not on crumbling stone or fragile parchment, but in the deepest archive of all, the human body. And at last, the bones speak louder than the lies. Across the digital age, a new kind of pyramid is rising, when not of stone, but of code and light. African scholars and diaspora communities are harnessing technology to reclaim the histories once stolen or silenced. With 3D modeling, they resurrect temples and palaces flattened by time or conquest. AI is being trained to unlock the secrets of the script, voices frozen for 2000 years inching closer to being heard again. Hidden manuscripts, once buried to escape fire or theft, are being digitized and shared by thousands of hands across the globe. This is technological archaeology, a resurrection pixel by pixel, algorithm by algorithm. Each scan, each translation, each virtual reconstruction stitches fragments of memory back into wholeness. For a new generation, the impact is transformative. On screens once filled with stereotypes and shame, African children now see monuments of genius and power, proof of ancestors who built, wrote, ruled, and dreamed. Where once history was a wound, now it becomes a mirror of pride. You walk into a museum, the air cool and reverent. Glass cases glitter with treasures, but the labels tell. A known civilization. Origin uncertain. You know that's a lie. The names are known. The kingdoms are named. But the truth has been folded away, hidden in the basement, out of sight. Down there, in the shadows, lie artifacts that never belonged here, bronzes turned from Benin, manuscripts smuggled from Timbuktu, statues ripped from Nubian sand. Some pieces are displayed with pride, while others are left to gather dust, deemed unworthy of the spotlight because they don't fit the story Western institutions want to tell. The fight for reputation rages on, but the excuses are endless. We're protecting them. They belong to the world. Meanwhile, tickets are sold, gift shops thrive, and ancestors' bones, literally and figuratively, fan the descendants of their captors. Next time you pass through those marble halls, ask yourself, who gets to decide where history lives? And whose trees are still being kept in chains? Silence doesn't just wound the people it targets, it impoverishes everyone. When African civilizations were buried under conquest, slavery, and erasure, the loss rippled outward across humanity itself. What medical cures were lost in the flames of Timbuktu's libraries? What architectural secrets died with the buildings of Great Zimbabwe and Benin's walls? What philosophies, spiritual frameworks, and sciences still lie locked in the script? Each act of silencing narrowed the horizon of human possibility. Instead of drawing from a wide river of knowledge, the world was forced to sip from a smaller stream, when shaped by conquest and exclusion. We are told progress is universal, but how many of our preventable mistakes, ecological collapse, economic exploitation, wars of empire, might have been avoided if more voices, more systems of wisdom, had survived the blade and the torch? The cost of this erasure is not just African, it is global. We are all living inside a collective amnesia, repeating errors our ancestors may already have solved. To restore these trees is not charity, and not nostalgia, it is survival. Until the silence is broken, the same tragedies will echo forward, unanswered. You're back in the tomb where this journey began, but it no longer feels empty. The silence stirs with names that were almost erased, the one-eyed queen who stood against Rome. The king who bent faith into strategy. Mansa Musa who turned gold into knowledge. The nameless engineers of Zimbabwe, who laid stone upon stone until their walls could carry whispers across centuries. To speak these names is to breathe life into them again. It is resurrection without temples, remembrance without permission. Every civilization falls, but only some are granted the dignity of memory. The rest wait in silence, their brilliance scattered like gold dust across forgotten stones. Tonight, when you close your eyes, whisper the names they tried to strip away. Feel the echo rising in your chest. That sound? That's history healing. That's the weight of ghosts becoming ancestors once more. And maybe, just maybe, the rain of recognition will fall, so that the dust no longer hides what should never have been forgotten.